Yeah, that's the title. And the content is, I will not speak so much about ODD and trace per se. I will just briefly say what it is, but a little bit the stories behind them, because it might inspire you a little bit and give you an idea why it makes sense and why it is important to think about and work about standards. So the ODD story, mostly a little bit about trace, and then really standards can considerably improve the state of the art in your science, and you don't have to wait. You can do it if you want. And then, of course, I will say a little bit more about the Open Modeling Foundation in a little bit more detail than Chris just had a chance to do. So the ODD protocol is a standard format for describing agent-based models. It has also been used in the meantime for other model types, but the original idea was agent-based model. Just briefly, it has 7 elements. They are grouped into an O part, overview, a D part, design concepts, the second D part, details. And the idea is that the overview part doesn't provide any detail, but still after you read it, you have a pretty good idea what the model is and does and why it was developed and things like that. And design concepts are not describing the model, but they're describing important criteria for designing the model. And not all of these concepts are used on all the models, so you can leave them out if they're not relevant. And then, of course, you have all the details which are needed if you really want to re-implement the model. Yeah, so the submodels, the processes, the foraging, the mating, the negotiations, the behavior of your agent, of the environment, all the details should be described there. And in so much detail that you can actually replicate the program, even without knowing the source code. Input data, so what kind of driving variables do you import and what's the initial state of your system? So that's more or less the ODD protocol. It was published in 2006. There was an update in 2010, and there's another one, 2020. The 2020 article, you will find it easily on the internet, comes with very extensive training material, examples, and add-ons. So the main work there is really in the supplement. So why ODD? So that's, I will explain in a second. Trace is a different story. ODD is for describing models. Trace is for documenting model development, testing, and analysis. That was developed really in the context of decision support, specifically if you want to, that the model, the ecological model, is affecting risk assessment of chemicals, of pesticides. Then the decision makers, the regulators, they want to know, could we trust this model? Where are we? So what are the criteria? And then we thought, well, good modeling practice, the main thing is that you really document all the detailed work, which you usually do as a good modeler, but don't document in your papers. So that's the basic idea of trace. So it's much more comprehensive and for a specific case for model supporting decisions, whereas ODD is just for agent-based models in general. That's the structure of the trace documents. You have sections also with a standard terminology, standard structure, problem formulation, model descriptions that could be ODD or a set of equations, data, and so on, model analysis. So this is, so to say, what ODD and trace are doing, but why did we come up with the idea of a standard format for describing agent-based models? So at the beginning of the 2000s, I and many others were convinced that really ecology, we are ecologists, needs agent-based models, individual-based models, as we call them in ecology. And the same is true for many, many other disciplines. Wherever you have decision-making, autonomous agents, this is a model type which has a full flexibility to do many things, which should be represented in the model if you want to get it right. I'm not saying this is the only model type, but this is a model type which we really need. But as I had to review many papers and deal as an editor and read many articles, I found that most model descriptions, ABM descriptions, were incomplete and without a clear structure or both. And that was at that time the main criticism in agent-based modeling. If you have a mathematical model, you just write down a few equations and that's it. But if you have a model type agent-based model, so you're not really sure what's going on there, this is, so to say, limiting its value as a scientific tool. Yeah, you know, the cornerstone of the scientific method is reproducibility. So you should describe your methods and materials in a way that others could reproduce what you did. And in most cases, it was not the case at the beginning of the 2000s. Moreover, design of most ABMs looked rather ad hoc. There was no clear rationale, throw in this, throw in that. A little bit frustrating. So this Homer Simpson here describes my feelings. Yeah, we need ABM, but the state of the art really is not so satisfying. And then you have to realize science is done by people, right? And then ABM at that time was still pretty new. Ecologists are using it since the beginning of the 90s, social scientists about 10 years later, but there are about 20 times more people in social sciences than ecology. So it's used heavily, but it's a pioneer phase, and pioneer phases are often quite chaotic. So we need to do something about it. And if you're unhappy with the state of the art in your field, no matter what it is, there's this management slogan, change it or leave it. I learned it from my niece. She's working at mid-level management at the Deutsche Bahn. And all the Germans know the Deutsche Bahn has many, many problems. And she said their slogan is change it or leave it. Yeah, don't complain all the time and be unhappy, but get your hands dirty and do something. So we had our book on individual-based ecology in 2005, Steve Raitsbeck and I. We have a chapter there about that we should have a standard format, but it's not really spelled out completely there, just a vague idea. But we had a workshop in 2004 in Bergen in Norway, and actually that photo at the bottom there is actually from that workshop 20 years ago. This hat in the foreground, that's actually Don DeAngelis. And so we discussed, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's try a common format. So we came up with this ODD idea. There were several revisions. But then we decided, so now we have this format. Just everybody should take one of their existing model descriptions and rewrite it according to ODD, to this new ODD. And so they did that. I got then 19 model descriptions rewritten according to ODD, and that was totally frustrating. I found it was a total mess. And I thought it's not going to work. So it was still so different, and it didn't look like a standard. It was still, I think one main reason is that people just were doing copy and paste and not really reformulating stuff, but still. So I put it aside for a couple of months, and then I thought at some point, well, let's have a look again. And then I did a stupid thing. I just made it all look similar. So I formatted it in a way that it has always the same font size, structure, headings, and so on. And after doing this, there's something like 60, 80 pages or so. I looked at the O parts, the overview parts. I thought, well, that's maybe not so bad. So we have very simple model, we have very complex forest models, but they all are explained on one page, what the model is, what it does, what the purpose is. Hey, that's kind of useful. So we decided let's just publish this. That won't hurt. But we didn't think very much about its success or impact. And then, to our big surprise, people started using it immediately, quickly. And obviously, not necessarily because ODD was so perfect or good, but because there was such a need for such a thing. Yeah, people were happy that they didn't have to come up with their own structure anymore. They could just follow the ODD and there it is, right? So that was something. But then there was a big surprise with ODD regarding model design. I mean, ODD was meant you have a model, now you want to write a paper, so you have to describe the model. Well, let's just use ODD, but if you do this for some time, it has an unexpected effect. So the question is, how do we design agent-based models? For software, we have this whole industry of design patterns, but for ABMs, important design patterns and criteria certainly exist, but where? So it's not so clear. It usually depends on the experience and on the background of the model, but there are no clear criteria. So what we really need is a list of clearly defined design concepts and checklists for formulating ABMs. And this would make development of ABMs more efficient and more coherent. The state of the art at the beginning of the 2000s was Everybody was following their own rationale, and it was also often not clear why things were included or not included. But ODD has, in the meantime, been used several thousand times, depending on the discipline. Between 5 and about 50% of the ABM papers are actually using it. So not everybody is using it, of course, but 3,000-4,000 citations, and I estimated 90% of the citations actually used it. It was designed merely for communication, for writing up a model description, but it turned out that it changes the way you formulate and design ABMs in the first place. And I made the same experience as my friend Uta Berger, who's also here in the audience. We are good friends, and one day she told me, you know what, Volker? Your ODD protocol, I thought it was a kind of a dull idea. Well, do we really need this? Standard or boring is that? But I made some of my students using it. And then at some point, you start thinking and speaking ODD. If you have done it 2 or 3 times, the next time somebody said, well, I got this cool agent-based models, and you say, wait a minute. What is the purpose of the model? What are the patterns you use for testing the models? What are the entities? What are the variables? What are the processes? Like a checklist, right? And so you start thinking and speaking ODD, and you also start expecting others to speak ODD to better understand what they do and mean. And we never had the idea that ODD would be more than just a format for describing model. No, it turns out that you start using it as a checklist in your head. And that really facilitates communication. And the good thing is that from the very beginning, ODD was also published in the Social Science by Gary Polhill in a couple of papers. So from the very beginning, it was spreading so beyond ecology, virtually everywhere where agent-based models are used. So why did it work? So why was it, so to say, adopted so quickly and so frequently? Overall, I think it is a very simple concept. There have been some critical voices about certain aspects, but mostly people were happy that we have it. It is obviously not so easy to use it correctly. But people ask me the last 15 years, Volker, what are you working on? I'm commenting and revising ODD model descriptions, actually. I mean, the software engineers among you might know this RTFM, you know what that means? Read the fine manual. So people don't really do this cautiously enough. So, but I said, we have this 2020 paper with lots of examples and guidance. So if you really read this and take it into account, it is a simple concept and it has direct benefits to those using it. You're not doing it to make your science a better place or to improve the culture. You're doing it because you have to do it anyway. You have to write a model description. And you might as well use ODD. And then at some point, if you have a critical mass, so that maybe 10, 20% of the people have already seen it, most readers, editors, reviewers are familiar with it and increasingly start expecting it. So at the beginning, when ODD was new, I did this sometimes. When I had to review a paper and the model description was good, so why should I demand anything else? But most often it was not good. It was incomplete. It was confusing. I said, you might try the ODD protocol, but then I always signed my reviews just to be fair and open. But I've seen this quite often now also by other reviewers that they say, well, the model description leaves out important parts. I don't know the rationale of your model assumption. Why don't you use ODD? So simple concept, it has direct benefits, and it quickly got the critical mass that people simply knew it, and then they had the choice of using it or not. There are still open questions. Does it really improve reproducibility? It has not been tested systematically. In principle, you should take 10 models prescribed with ODD and 10 models with some other format and then test it. Does it make design less ad hoc? I have the feeling it does, but it's very hard to quantify. But maybe it could actually be turned into a general language, a lingua franca across disciplines, like English is in science. Maybe at least the O part, that would be my vision, that it turns agent-based modeling into a coherent and efficient methodology. It facilitates communication. People in the economics, geosciences, earth sciences, social sciences, geography, ecology, they all have their own terminologies, they all have their own culture. But if they all would use ODD, well, we have a common language then. I mean, just take the word state variable. You wouldn't believe how many emails I had to write or explanations to give what I, with my background in physics and biology, mean by state variables. But at some point, people get it and they know this is the meaning of state variables. So we use it in that way. So that could be the basis of a common language, which is non-formal. It's not linked to any computer programming language or to mathematics and so. That would then lead to a unifying perception of emergence. And I think that's a absolute condition for a more general theory of agent-based complex systems. That's my vision, and I hope also we can follow that vision in the Open Modeling Foundation. I will get back to that later. However, I said using ODD does not require additional effort. You have to do it anyway. But what if you suggest a standard which does require additional effort? That's a completely different story. And if you talk to people working in laboratories, there is this good laboratory practice and they all hate it. It's a pain in the neck because you have to document every single move you do. It's really, people don't like it, but it is required by people, by customers, by law partially, right? So I would say bottom-up launching of standard is possible if it makes things easier, which the people have to do anyway. So if you have an idea of improving the scientific practice in your field, like with ODD, find a team and go for it. So this is, so to say, the take-home message from the ODD story. This can have some quite impact, and others might take up your idea and develop it further. For example, my colleague Birgit Müller and colleagues, they developed this ODD plus D, where this third D is for decision making, because they felt that if we want to describe ABMs, which include human decision making, it would be worthwhile to have some additional categories to characterize the way and how human decision making is represented. And there are a couple of other extensions of ODD, but this one is the most frequently used one, several hundred times. But what if it requires additional effort? And that's the case for trace. Yeah, if you really do this, if you really document what you did and all these different steps of model development, you easily get a document like this. This was by Daniel Ayon. He implemented a brown trout model developed by Steve Railsback, and this is his trace document. It has 100 pages. Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's also a very complex model. But look, for example, only at just data evaluation. You have user-specified parameters, site-specific parameters, parameters with values borrowed from the literature, and calibrated parameters. Very few existing publications specify this information. And I think it's very important to have this information. If you have a model which is supposed to support decision-making and 90% of the parameters are guesstimated or calibrated, well, maybe you should not trust it as much as if there is a model where most of the parameters have been developed directly, and so on. So this is really additional effort. Yeah, so trace is a good thing. You have a supplement to your paper or report, and it does add transparency and credibility, and it can increase acceptance and impact. And I have heard stories of people where they got their papers accepted because reviewers and editors were critical, but they were looking things up in the trace document, and they were convinced, well, yeah, this is based on some thorough analysis and some really hard work. But still, trace documents. There may be something like 30 or 40 full trace documents, which is 2 orders of magnitude less than ODD, which reflects simply the fact that it requires additional effort and people do not yet expect it, right? Of course, we expect the model descriptions, but nobody so far expected the supplement with all this kind of information. Yeah, so this kind of standard is much more difficult to establish and to get. So why would people still use it? Maybe because, like Daniel Ayon, who did it, he said, it should be like that. I have my own standards, I have my own way of doing things, and I think it should really be communicated. Or because it has been required by some authority which has the power to do so. Yeah, so authorities may require certain standards. OECD has all kinds of standards for laboratory practice. EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority. They actually have released a standard best practice for modeling. DIN is Deutsche Industrienorm. So sorry, there are fields and there are contexts where authorities require it, and you just have to do it, like with good laboratory practice. But the alternative is that the scientific community may self-organize and agree on certain standards, which then more easily leads to the critical mass of usage, so they become expected. And it worked like that with the FAIR principles, relatively new, 2016, the first paper, something like 20, 30 authors, similar to the ODD paper. And again, it caught on immediately. Everybody knows now the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible for data, and more recently also for software. And obviously, again, like with ODD, people knew there is a need. We need to do something about it. This chaotic way of partly or not at all keeping the data available, which are underlying a study, and the same for the software and the testing. This is a state which is unacceptable, and people really were grateful that some people came up with these standards. And I think also the acronym played a big role, because sometimes it's really the acronym. By the way, ODD was originally called PSPC +3. Luckily, some reviewers told us that this is really ugly. So this is exactly what the Open Modeling is trying to do, the Open Modeling Foundation, which was launched about 2 years ago. And this is a web page. If you look for Open Modeling Foundation, you find it. I have to warn you, the web page is a little bit, the structure grew over the years, and they are working on a new version right now. So if you're a little bit patient, you will find the relevant information. And here is the mission. The Open Modeling Foundation is an alliance of modeling organizations that coordinates and administers a common community-developed body of standards and best practices among diverse communities of modeling scientists. The driving figure behind OMF is Michael Barton from Arizona State University, plus a number of colleagues, but he's, so to say, who got the grant, who had the vision. And the basic idea is that the members are not people, the members are modeling organizations, like my center. My center is a member of OMF. And people can subscribe to working groups. I will put a link on the final slides. So if you're interested in joining, everybody is welcome. You just have to register, and then you will be invited to the meetings of these groups, and the groups have subgroups where people actually working on manuscripts, on papers, right now. I will give an overview in a minute. And there are very clear bylaws or the charter for how standards are developed. So there is a working group developing a standard on something. The standard will be then presented to the steering council committee of OMF. They might send it back. They might require some changes. And at some point, these member organizations, everybody of these member organizations is represented by one person. And then if the majority of these members agree with it, then this will be a standard launched by OMF. And of course, all the organizations then will, I wouldn't say require, but they will strongly suggest that within the organization, the standard is used. We are not there yet, and it might take a year or two before we have the first standard developed in this way. But this is, so to say, the idea that we can also launch standards which require additional effort. But we have, so to say, the critical mass of people supporting it from the very beginning. It's a long, slow process, but I think this design of your OMF, which was basically developed by Michael, is really a good one. So we have working groups, and you can subscribe to one or more working groups very easily. The standards working group I'm co-chairing is with 3 others. These are the sub-working groups we have right now. We're working on a white paper on standards, kind of a stock taking. What do we mean by standards? How is it working with standards in other fields? And we have a group working on fit for purpose, which is related to trace and more. I'm leading a group on lingua franca, so to say, using the O part of the ODD protocol as a general non-technical language for talking to each other and also to stakeholders. One group is working on all the hidden assumptions which are behind model design, which are really critical, but often just not documented. And we have also one group, it's calling themselves Devil's Advocate, who are asking the question, why the hell do we need standards? Do we always need standards, right? Maybe standards have also some repercussions and bad elements. So it's important to ask that. Chris already mentioned the certification group led by Chris and Sandra. And their first contribution to OMF is a series of ModelShare workshops. There will be 7. This is the first one. And this link here shows you an overview of these workshops. We have an education and outreach group, and we have a cyber infrastructure group. And all these groups will be represented in these ModelShare workshops. So if you want to join OMF, just go to this webpage, find it somewhere, and request to join. You just fill in your name, your institution, and if you're a professor or a student, what your background is, and then you will be on the list of that subgroup, and you will be invited to the meetings, and you can contribute. Either you just listen, or you'd really jump into it and contribute actively. It's totally up to you. And if you are not active, not doing anything, it also doesn't hurt anybody. So if you don't have time for half a year or so, that's totally fine. So to summarize, so I think we all agree that standards and best practices for modeling are needed because models are needed to meet the current challenges, with global change and societal change and democracies and natural resources and so on and so on. And we all know that these systems are so complex that the empirical method, just doing controlled experiments, is not possible usually. So models are used heavily, but the practice is not always satisfying. And so we need standards, we need easy ways to evaluate these models and to test them and then to make it more coherent. So I think this is really at the forefront. It's not just a hobby of some crazy bureaucrats and bee counters. It's really something which is at the heart of science and of societal challenges which we have right now. I think working on standards is fun. It sounds boring. Standards, come on. No, it is not, because it's not so easy to find just the balance between simplicity and usefulness. So it is challenging. It requires creativity and clear thinking, but it can be very rewarding in terms of impact. So original research papers, so to say, yes, we have to do them. We all should do this, but having methods paper, and this is methods in the widest sense, are at least equally important to advance your science. So working on standards requires clear thinking, teamwork, and patience, endurance. Bottom up is possible, but not enough. So if you have an idea, write a paper, put it out and see what happens. But OMF is a chance also for more complex activities. It depends on us. Just join it. So join OMF and you will see the lands and the seas. That's it for me today. Thank you very much.